Champagne glasses clinked as laughter echoed throughout the country club. My son, Daniel, leaned back, smirked, and declared, "This mansion? My dad just lives there. I'm the real owner now." His in-laws laughed, and I sat there, my heart pounding, the silence wrapping around me like chains. He thought I was powerless. But then, before we get into the story, if you believe that karma always finds a way, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Champagne sweat beaded down the flutes while the string quartet tied polite bows around the room. I sat among crisp collars and diamond wrists, the country club smelling like money and lemon oil. My son Daniel leaned back, one arm draped over his chair like a prince surveying peasants, and said the sentence that quieted every fork. "This mansion? My dad just lives there. I'm the real owner now." Laughter. Bright. Cruel. His in-laws glowed victors who hadn't built a single wall. I kept my face still. Inside, the burn worked its way through my ribs. I am Luis Sanchez, 70 years old, retired architect, husband, father. I have measured whole lives in blue lines and pencil dust. I have watched roofs lift and catch their first light. And I have never cried in front of strangers. Daniel smirked, soaking in the applause that did not belong to him. He used to chase after me with a toy hammer, tap-tapping the air as I tapped real nails. One day, he'd say, "I'll build with you, Dad." I remember his small hands, the way they trusted the world. I remember promising myself I would give him everything I never had. So I did. First came the house, our house. I drafted it on a winter night when my hands ached and the coffee went cold. I designed the staircase to rise like a calm breath. I set the kitchen window to swallow the sunset whole. I poured concrete with my crew, stayed late to smooth edges no one else would see. Every arch, every joint, every hidden beam signed in the quiet color of a father's devotion. Then came his schooling. I paid every tuition bill, every textbook, every internship move across cities he barely knew how to pronounce. I sold company shares when the markets were sour, and the timing was worse. I smiled and said it was nothing. It was not nothing. It was years. It was youth. It was sleep. He graduated in business, shiny shoes, loud handshake, the kind of confidence that makes strangers lean in. I clapped the longest. I told him the mansion was his birthright to protect, not to possess. He nodded and hugged me. For a second, I recognized the boy with the toy hammer. Then he married into money. A different gravity took hold. Conversations tilted, rooms weighed me down. His wife's family talked in brand names and fun tranches until their laughs turned to little knives. At holidays they introduced me as the retired builder, as if the word architect would burn their tongues. I swallowed it. I told myself love is a long project. It needs patience, not demolition. Now, at this gleaming table, Daniel raised a glass toward me like a trophy he'd hunted. "To new ownership," he said. New ownership. The band kept playing violin over piano while waiters moved like chess pieces around gossip. My wife's hand found my knee under the linen and pressed, a quiet anchor. I nodded once. I chewed air. I watched my son perform a version of himself that I did not recognize. He thought I was powerless. He mistook silence for surrender, age for weakness, politeness for permission. He forgot the language of the ground we stand on. Foundations do not brag, they hold. I let my eyes travel the room, the gilded frames, the posed smiles, the in-law patriarch tapping his glass with a ring heavy enough to bruise. I pictured the mansion's skeleton, the steel, the rebar, the bones only I could name. I pictured the deed, the original parchment with my name in ink that refuses to fade. I took a breath. I let their laughter spend itself. And in that breath, thin, steady, mine, I felt something shift. Not rage, not even grief. Calculations. Load, stress, timing, sequence. I have built through earthquakes and budgets and men who said no. I know how to move quietly until the moment a structure stands on truth and everything false slides off like dust. So I sat still and let the moment set. Because I had already learned the most important lesson in construction. You do not answer noise with noise. You answer it with a plan. The night after that dinner, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my study, the old drafting lamp glowing over rolled blueprints that smelled of dust and ink. My hands rested on the table, stiff and tired, but I could still feel the rhythm of hammer and chisel inside my bones. Every line on those drawings was my handwriting, every measurement my faith in something permanent. That mansion was not a house, it was a promise. I had built it when Daniel was still a boy. I remember his laughter echoing through the empty frame, his little sneakers slapping against unfinished floors. He used to run from room to room shouting, "This one's mine! This will be my kingdom!" And I would laugh, wiping sweat from my forehead, telling him to be careful near the scaffolding. I wanted him to grow up inside walls that whispered his father's devotion. I wanted every corner to remind him that love could be made solid. I designed the staircase so he could race his friends 2 steps at a time. I carved the backyard into terraces so he could kick a soccer ball without losing it down a slope. I planted oak trees along the fence line so he would one day sit in their shade, old and proud, telling his own children how his father planned for him. Every paycheck I earned in those years went into that house. We lived modestly so I could pour money into bricks, stone, steel. My wife never once complained. She called it our cathedral, and she prayed it would hold us together. I believed her. When Daniel was old enough, I let him hold the blueprints with me. His small finger traced the lines like they were magic paths. "One day, Dad, I'll design my own house and you'll help me build it," he said, grinning wide. I believed him. I wanted so badly to believe that my son carried my spirit of creation. But somewhere between that boy and the man I saw at the country club, something cracked. I don't know if it was the shine of wealth, or the way his wife's family looked down on us, or his hunger for recognition. What I do know is that the mansion I poured my soul into had become his stage for arrogance. That night, staring at those blueprints, I realized I had built more than a home. I had built the weapon he thought he owned. He had no idea that the roots of this place ran through me and only me. He had forgotten what I had given, but I had not. Daniel was 17 when the talk of college began. He wanted business, not architecture, and though it stung, I encouraged him. I told him the world needed builders of all kinds, those who raise walls and those who raise companies. I promised him I would make it happen, no matter the cost, and I did. I worked late into the night on projects I should have turned down. I took commissions far outside my comfort zone warehouses, commercial blocks, anything that paid well and fast. My knees ached, my hands stiffened, but every dollar I tucked away carried Daniel closer to his dream. I told myself the pain was worth it. After all, this was my son. When the tuition bills came, I didn't hesitate. 4 years of business school, then graduate programs, then internships that demanded he live in cities we could barely pronounce. I wrote check after check. My wife clipped coupons, sold jewelry, even skipped doctor visits so we could cover the costs. I told her not to worry, that this was an investment, and one day Daniel would repay us with honor. To make it work, I sold part of my company's shares. Decades of sweat equity, gone in a single transaction. My retirement fund emptied piece by piece. I smiled when Daniel asked if it was difficult. "Not at all," I lied. He never saw the nights I stayed awake, staring at numbers that didn't add up, wondering if I had gambled my future too recklessly. But when I watched him graduate cap high, diploma in hand, his face glowing with triumph, I believed it was worth it. My heart swelled as he shook hands with professors and spoke about his big plans. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered, pulling me into an embrace. I held him tight, my throat thick with hope. I thought of the house, of the blueprints, of everything I had sacrificed, and I told myself this was the payoff. For a brief moment, I let myself believe the story would end there, with a son who honored his father, and a father who had given everything without regret. But stories have a way of turning, and mine was just beginning to crack. Daniel's graduation felt like sunlight breaking through years of sacrifice, but clouds moved in faster than I expected. It began with subtle changes. His phone calls became shorter, his visits less frequent. He always had a meeting, an event, an opportunity that couldn't wait. When he finally came home, it wasn't to sit with me or walk the gardens we once tended together. It was to announce his engagement. Her name was Clarissa. She came from a family whose wealth was measured not in dollars but in generations, old money, old power. At the engagement dinner, I shook her father's hand, a grip limp and dismissive, his eyes sliding over me as if I were part of the furniture. Her mother wore jewels heavier than my mortgage had ever been, and when she leaned close to Daniel, she called him a step up. I laughed politely, but inside, something splintered. After the wedding, the distance between us widened. At gatherings with her family, I noticed the way Daniel's posture changed. He straightened his back, smoothed his words, and whenever I spoke, he cut me off with a gentle correction, as if my years of building meant little compared to their moneyed opinions. I was Dad in private, but in their world, I was the retired builder. They couldn't even say architect. The title caught in their throats, too respectable for the role they wanted me to play. I told myself to endure it. Families take time to blend. Pride is a tricky wall it needs patience to hold. So I swallowed the insults, even when Daniel echoed them with a smirk. Once, at a dinner, Clarissa's uncle praised Daniel's natural talent for business, and Daniel smiled, saying, "I guess I didn't inherit much from Dad besides a roof to live under." Laughter spilled across the table. I held my fork steady, my wife's hand trembling against mine beneath the linen. Brick by brick, the respect I thought I had built crumbled in front of me. The son I had carried through life was now carrying the weight of another family's pride, and in that weight I was being buried. I told myself it was temporary, that one day he would remember where he came from. But the truth is, he was already rewriting the story and erasing me from it. And every time I let it pass, another piece of me went with it. By the time we gathered again at the country club, the distance between us had grown into a canyon. Daniel no longer looked at me as a father, he looked through me, as if I were just another piece of furniture in a mansion he believed was his. That night, the chandeliers glowed like captured stars, and the air smelled of wine and polished wood. It was supposed to be a celebration of his latest success. The table was long, draped in white linen, crowded with his in-laws and their friends. They laughed in clipped tones, trading stories of acquisitions and vacations on islands I had only ever seen on postcards. My wife and I sat quietly at the far end, guests in a place that should have been ours. She reached for my hand, her eyes already brimming with the dread she knew was coming. Daniel rose, his glass in hand, his voice smooth and confident. "This mansion?" he said, pausing just enough to draw every eye. "My dad just lives there. I'm the real owner now. At as the tan." The words echoed, sharper than crystal breaking. His in-laws erupted in laughter, clinking glasses as if they were celebrating a victory. I sat frozen, my chest burning, my jaw locked tight. He knew what he was doing. He wanted me small, smaller than the chair I sat on, smaller than the shadow I cast. I felt the eyes on me, some pitying, most mocking. They didn't see the years I spent drafting that house, the nights I stayed awake figuring how to pour concrete with too little money, the decades of work that bled into every corner of its foundation. To them, I was just an old man taking up space in a story that belonged to Daniel now. My wife whispered my name under her breath, urging me not to speak. I didn't. I couldn't. I let the silence wrap around me like chains, heavy and suffocating. For the first time I understood, no one at that table would ever stand for me. Not Daniel, not his wife, not their family. In their world, I was already erased. But inside, beneath the humiliation, something steadier than rage began to rise. A reminder, a truth. The deed was still mine. The walls, the beams, the blood and the mortar, they all belonged to me. Daniel had taken my silence for weakness. He had mistaken patience for surrender. He thought I was powerless. He was wrong. That night, I didn't shout. I didn't fight. I sat with the weight of their laughter pressing down on me, and I made a promise only I could hear. One day soon, the truth would stand taller than their lies. And when it did, it would not need applause. The night after Daniel's declaration at the country club, I walked the mansion halls alone. The silence of the house I had built weighed heavier than the laughter that had mocked me hours earlier. My hand traced the wall's plaster, smooth beneath my fingers, and I remembered the first day I dreamed this place into being. I had wanted a home that would outlast me, a monument to family, to sacrifice, to love. But what I remembered most vividly wasn't the walls. It was the cost. Daniel had always dreamed big. When he was 18, he told me he wanted to start his own company straight out of college. I admired the ambition, though I worried about the risk. Still, I told him yes. I told him I would help. I convinced myself that a father's role was to lift the weight his son couldn't carry yet. I sold shares of my company, decades of sweat traded for fast cash. I liquidated my retirement fund, the one my wife and I had quietly built for gray-haired years we thought we would spend traveling or finally resting. Instead, every cent went into Daniel's dream. I watched him smile as the first office lease was signed, the ink barely dry before he was shaking hands with partners I didn't trust. His eyes shone with the fire of youth, and I let myself believe that fire would light our family's future. But fires, I would learn, can burn through more than darkness. The first venture collapsed within a year. Daniel brushed it off with a laugh. Part of the game, Dad. You win some, you lose some. I wanted to believe him, so I gave more. Another loan, another sacrifice. Another night staring at numbers that bled red. My wife's eyes grew tired from worry, but she never scolded. She only asked, "Are you sure?" And I always answered yes. Looking back, I see the truth. I wasn't investing in a company. I was investing in a bond I couldn't bear to lose. Every dollar was another plea. Don't forget who built you, son. Don't erase me from your story. But Daniel was already learning how to stand taller by making me smaller, and I kept paying the price. The second business Daniel launched came with even bigger promises. He told me it was the future import and export, high return, minimal risk. He wore suits, sharper than knives, spoke with the confidence of a man who believed the world already belonged to him. And when he leaned across my kitchen table, asking for more capital, I felt the same tug I had felt since he was a boy with a toy hammer. I wanted to believe. I wanted to see him rise. So I gave again. I dipped into savings we had no right to touch. I mortgaged land that was meant to keep us safe. My wife argued this time, her voice breaking as she reminded me that we were not young anymore, that we needed security. I told her Daniel just needed one chance done right. I told her this was the last time. But it wasn't. Within months, the venture soured. The partners he praised disappeared. Money bled out faster than it came in. I received calls at night, creditors demanding guarantees I hadn't realized I had signed. Daniel shrugged it off, told me these things happened in business, and promised the next one would be better. I swallowed my anger. I told myself it was my duty as a father to shield him until he found his footing. Yet every check I wrote, every loan I co-signed, carved deeper lines into my face. I remember standing in front of the bathroom mirror, toothbrush dangling, and barely recognizing the man staring back. My hair had thinned, my shoulders bent. I looked like a man twice my age. Sacrifice, I realized, doesn't always feel noble. Sometimes it feels like decay. But still, I paid. I covered debts Daniel barely acknowledged. I attended meetings to keep creditors at bay, telling them stories of future profits that even I no longer believed. Each lie was another brick in the wall I built around him, protecting him from consequences he had earned. I told myself I was buying time for him to grow. What I was really doing was burying myself under the weight of his failures. And the cruelest part? He never saw it. He never asked what it cost me to keep him standing. Family dinners used to be simple, just plates of rice, beans, roasted meat, and laughter that filled every corner of our kitchen. But once Daniel married Clarissa, those dinners changed. They no longer happened at our table. They happened at hers, long oak tables dressed in silverware I was afraid to touch. The air there was always heavy, like a courtroom where I was the accused. I would sit quietly while her family paraded their wealth through stories of vacation villas, art auctions, and the latest political galas. They dropped names I didn't know, spoken figures I could hardly imagine. And each time I tried to add some memory from my years as an architect, or a story about building the mansion brick by brick, Daniel cut me off with a smile that wasn't a smile at all. "Dad's retired now," he'd say, as if the word carried shame. "He doesn't really keep up with these things." Laughter followed, sharp and polite, and I shrank smaller in my chair. Clarissa's father once raised his glass and toasted Daniel as the true heir of vision in the Sanchez line. He never looked at me when he said it. He didn't have to. I felt the sting all the same. Daniel beamed, soaking in their praise as if it were sunlight, while I sat in the shadow of my own bloodline. Even the children, their nieces and nephews, began to echo it. "Uncle Daniel is so successful," they'd chirp, their voices rehearsed from the adults around them. Not once did they mention the house, the sacrifices, the quiet man at the end of the table who had built the very roof above their heads. The worst part wasn't their laughter. It was my wife's silence. She sat beside me, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on her plate. I knew she felt the cuts as deeply as I did, but she feared that speaking would only drive Daniel further away. So we sat, night after night, eating their food, swallowing their pride, letting our own son use us as props in his theater of wealth. That was when I realized humiliation doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it comes dressed in fine suits, delivered with smiles, wrapped in applause that doesn't belong to you. And every bite I swallowed tasted like ash. One evening, after another suffocating dinner at Clarissa's family estate, my wife and I drove home in silence. The road was dark, lined with trees that bent toward one another like weary old men. Halfway back, she reached over and took my hand, her touch trembling. Finally, she spoke, her voice low enough that I almost missed it. "Luis, maybe stop giving so much." Her words cut deeper than Daniel's insults ever had. She had never once asked me to hold back, never questioned my sacrifices. For decades, she had stood beside me, clipping coupons, selling jewelry, enduring lean years without complaint. And now, for the first time, she was afraid. Afraid that I had given away too much of myself, too much of us. I tried to smile, to reassure her. I told her Daniel was just finding his way, that his success would repay everything tenfold. But even as I spoke, I heard the hollowness in my voice. She heard it too. Her eyes glistened in the passing headlights, filled with a sadness I couldn't bear to face. At home, I sat in my study, staring at the stacks of bills, the dwindling savings, the empty spaces where securities used to be. I could hear my wife in the next room, softly crying into her pillow. I wanted to go to her, to promise her it would all be worth it. But the truth was heavier than any promise I could make. I didn't know if I had the strength left to keep carrying Daniel's failures. Still, the next morning, I put on the mask again. I acted steady, calm, the rock Daniel could lean on. I let him talk about his next venture, his next grand idea, his next request for money. And when he looked at me with those expectant eyes, the same eyes that once lit up when I showed him how to measure a wall, I couldn't say no. I convinced myself it was love. But love had started to feel like chains. Every sacrifice bent me lower. Every insult pressed me deeper into the ground. My wife's silence at dinners, her trembling hand on mine, those were the only signs left that she saw the toll it was taking. What I remember most is not the weight of the money I lost. It was the weight of her tears, shed quietly in the night while I pretended not to hear. There came a time when Daniel stopped mentioning me at all. At business events, at family gatherings, even in interviews that found their way into glossy magazines. He spoke as if he had built his success from nothing but his own brilliance. My name vanished from his story, like ink erased from a page. Once, I stood at the back of a conference hall while he gave a speech to investors. He spoke of his early struggles, of clawing his way up without help, of sheer determination. I built myself, he said. The audience applauded, their faces bright with admiration. I felt invisible, a ghost watching his own son rewrite history. What hurt most wasn't the omission. It was the pride in his voice, the certainty. He believed the lie, and so did they. At dinners with his in-laws, he began to make little jokes at my expense. "Dad never understood the market," he'd say with a chuckle, and the table would laugh. Or, "My father was good with bricks, not numbers." Each jab chipped away at me, yet I stayed silent. My wife would place her hand on my leg, urging me to endure it, whispering later that it was better not to cause a scene. She was right, but each silence felt like surrender. There was one night I will never forget. We were at the mansion, my mansion, though Daniel called it his. Guests mingled through the halls, admiring the architecture, praising Daniel's taste. He walked beside them, nodding, smiling, never once mentioning that the house had been designed by my hand, paid for by my sacrifice. I trailed behind, listening as strangers credited my son with work that had come from my very soul. I stopped in front of the staircase, the one I had measured and remeasured until every step rose in perfect rhythm. A guest ran her hand along the rail and said, "Exquisite, truly a masterpiece." Daniel grinned and said, "Yes, I take pride in details." The 7 pretty 10. I stood there, my chest hollow, my throat tight. In that moment, I realized he wasn't just forgetting me. He was erasing me. My legacy, my life's work, my sacrifices, they were being painted over by his ambition, as if I had never existed, and I let it happen. I let the lie live because I thought one day, maybe, he would remember the truth on his own. But the truth is, Daniel had no intention of remembering. Some nights, when the weight of it all pressed too heavily, I would drive to my old office. The building sat quiet, its windows dark, a hollow shell of the life I had once built. I would stand there with the keys still in my pocket, staring at the empty lobby where my name used to hang in brass letters, Sanchez and Partners, now just dust and echoes. I walked through those rooms, my footsteps lonely against the tile. Drafting tables sat abandoned, the air stale with paper that no longer held promise. I remembered nights spent here with coffee gone cold, drawing line after line until sunrise. I remembered clients shaking my hand, thanking me for turning their dreams into concrete and steel. I remembered the pride of creating something that would outlast me. And then I thought of Daniel at that very moment, likely drinking, laughing, throwing money into ventures he didn't understand. My sacrifices had bought him freedom, but he used that freedom to burn. He didn't see the ruins he left behind. He didn't care. I ran my hand along the wall, rough with old paint, and I whispered to myself, "This is what building means. It is slow. It is patient. It is enduring." Daniel never learned that. He thought success was quick, flashy, loud. He thought respect was inherited by marriage, not earned by sweat. He had no idea that the very ground he stood on was sinking because he never cared to see the foundation. The contrast was unbearable. My life had been a steady climb, brick after brick, year after year. His was a sprint across thin ice, hoping it would never crack. And each time it did, I was the one plunging into the cold to drag him out. I stood there until dawn, the light creeping through the blinds. My office, once alive with creation, was nothing but memory now. Just like me, forgotten, overshadowed, replaced by the illusion Daniel paraded as truth. Walking out, I locked the door one final time and felt a bitter thought tighten in my chest. I had given him everything, even the pieces of myself I could never rebuild. And still, he used my silence as proof I had no worth left. But memory is not weakness. Memory is evidence. The final blow came quietly, like a knife slipped between ribs. It was another dinner, another stage for Daniel to play the role of self-made man. The wine was rich, the room full of suits and silk, and I was just another chair filling space at the table. A guest raised a glass to Daniel, praising his rise in business. And Daniel, my son, smiled, leaned back, and said, "I built everything myself. My father? He was just along for the ride. Just along for the ride." The words hit harder than any debt collector's call, harder than any sleepless night spent signing checks I couldn't afford. They stripped me of decades in a heartbeat. My life's sacrifices reduced to dead weight in his story. The table laughed, glasses clinked, and I felt my wife's hand tremble on mine, as powerless to stop it as I was. I stared at Daniel, waiting, hoping for some flicker of recognition, some acknowledgement of the cruelty in his words. But there was nothing, just the gleam of pride in his eyes, as if erasing me had made him taller. That night, I couldn't eat, I couldn't speak. I sat with their laughter echoing in my skull, replaying every moment. I had lifted him higher, selling my shares, draining my retirement, building him a home, giving him a name. And now he used that name as a stage to deny me. When we returned home, my wife asked me not to take it to heart. She said Daniel didn't mean it, that he was just performing for their approval. But I knew better. He meant every word. He wanted me gone from his story. I sat in the study until morning, the house dark and quiet around me. I thought about the mansion, about the deed tucked safely away, about every receipt, every tuition payment, every signature that still bore my name. I thought about the truth buried beneath his lies. And for the first time, the ache in my chest shifted. It was no longer just grief. It was something colder, sharper. The scission forming. He thought I had nothing left. He thought I was finished. But I was not finished. Not yet. The morning after Daniel erased me from his story for the last time, I opened the old cedar chest in my study. It had sat untouched for years, its brass hinges stiff, its wood carrying the smell of dust and memory. Inside lay the records of a lifetime blueprints, letters, contracts, proof that I had existed, that I had built, that I had given. At the very bottom, wrapped in parchment and care, I found it, the deed to the mansion. My name inked across the page in firm strokes that had outlived decades. Luis Sanchez. No co-owner, no transfer, no Daniel. For a long moment I simply stared at it. My fingers trembled as I held the paper, the weight of it heavier than any stone I had ever lifted. It was not just property. It was truth. It was the foundation Daniel had tried to bury beneath his arrogance. All this time, he had been bragging about something he never owned. He had been standing in a house that did not legally belong to him. A bitter laugh escaped my chest. After all the sacrifices, the debts, the humiliation, this single page proved that the house, the symbol of his false pride, was still mine. I placed the deed carefully on the desk, smoothing the edges flat. My mind sharpened. Memory was no longer enough. Evidence had weight, and I had it in my hands. I spent the rest of that day combing through the chest. Tuition receipts, loan agreements, bank transfers, all signed by me. All proof that the empire Daniel claimed to have built on his own had been raised on my back. The mansion, his education, his failed ventures, every one of them had my fingerprints on it. Daniel had erased me in words. But paper does not lie. For the first time in years, I felt steady. My son thought he had stripped me of everything. What he didn't realize was that I had been keeping records longer than he had been alive, and in those records lay the weapon he could never see coming. Once the deed lay on my desk, I couldn't stop. I pulled open drawer after drawer, uncovering a paper trail that Daniel had long forgotten or perhaps never cared to notice. Tuition receipts stacked high like bricks, every semester stamped with my name. Wire transfers to universities and cities across the country, funds drained from accounts I had bled dry. I remembered each sacrifice as I touched the pages. The jewelry my wife sold, the nights we skipped repairs, the vacations we never took. Then came the loan agreements, crisp signatures mine promising to repay sums that should never have been mine to shoulder. I read the dates, the interest rates, the terms I had swallowed without question just to keep Daniel's dreams afloat. My stomach twisted as I realized how many years of my life I had signed away for his ventures that ended in smoke. I even found the faded check stubs from when I sold my company shares. That was the hardest to look at. Those shares were supposed to be our future, our cushion against old age. Instead, they had been liquidated to feed Daniel's ambitions. Every stub was a scar, proof of a father's desperation to believe in his son. And then, tucked between folders, I discovered letters, thank you notes from professors, letters of recommendation addressed to me, acknowledging my support of Daniel. They praised his potential, admired his confidence, but each line was a quiet reminder that his rise had been scaffolded by my sacrifices. The more I uncovered, the colder I became. This wasn't just memory, it was evidence, undeniable and absolute. Daniel could charm a room, twist words, erase my presence in his speeches, but he could not erase ink. Paper does not forget. Paper does not forgive. I laid everything out on the desk, arranging the pieces like a blueprint. And that's when it struck me. All these years, I thought I was just funding his life. But what I had really been building was a record. A silent, unbreakable structure of proof. And now, finally, I understood its purpose. Daniel had built lies. I had built evidence. And evidence always outlasts lies. Evidence is heavy, but it also steadies you. As I spread the papers across my desk, the weight of humiliation began to lift, replaced by something colder, more precise. Still, I knew documents alone wouldn't be enough. Daniel was charming, practiced in twisting truth until people swallowed it whole. If I wanted the world to see him clearly, I needed more than ink and signatures. I needed witnesses. So I made calls. Quietly, carefully. First, I reached out to old business partners, men and women, who had known me long before Daniel learned to walk in shiny shoes. One after another, they remembered. They remembered how I sold my shares to fund his first company. They remembered how I walked into meetings, shoulders heavy, defending debts Daniel had created. Some still had records, tucked away emails, signed agreements, notes scribbled during negotiations. Proof that it was me, not him, carrying the burden. Then I spoke to family friends, the ones who had watched Daniel grow, who had sat at our table, eaten meals bought with money I had scraped together. They shook their heads as I told them what he had said at the country club. Not one of them was surprised. They had seen the arrogance creeping in over the years, the way he puffed his chest higher when his in-laws were around. They offered sympathy, yes, but more importantly, they offered memory. Their voices could echo mine if the time came. Each conversation was like laying another stone into a foundation. For so long, I had been the only one carrying the truth, the only one bleeding quietly while Daniel strutted in borrowed feathers. But now I saw clearly. I was not alone. There were others who had witnessed the sacrifices, the loans, the humiliations. Others who could testify, if not in court, then in the court of public opinion. When I hung up the last call, I sat back in my chair and felt a stillness settle over me. Daniel had erased me in stories, but I was rebuilding my presence, piece by piece. This wasn't about anger anymore. It was about architecture, the careful design of a truth that could not collapse. And for the first time in years, I felt like the architect again, not of buildings, but of justice. Once I had the deed, the receipts, and the voices of those who remembered, I began to think differently. Not like a father wounded, but like an architect again. Every building needs a plan, a sequence of steps. I had spent years letting Daniel's arrogance batter me, but now I could see clearly. If I wanted truth to stand, I needed to build it brick by brick. I started with observation. At family gatherings, I watched Daniel carefully, the way he bragged, the way he lied with a smile. He boasted about his mansion to anyone who would listen, his in-laws nodding with smug pride. They never asked for proof. They didn't need it. His confidence was enough for them. But I knew that one day, when the proof appeared, that same confidence would become his noose. I also began to keep notes, small details, dates, words, gestures. Like the night Daniel claimed at a party that he had paid off the mansion's construction himself. I wrote it down. Or the brunch, where he told a cousin that I was lucky to have a roof over my head. I wrote that down too. Lies are fragile things, and the more you collect them, the easier they are to break. At night, I organized the evidence like I once arranged blueprints. The deed at the center. Around it, concentric rings, tuition receipts, loan documents, transfer slips, witness testimonies. Each piece connected to the next. A framework of truth so strong that not even Daniel's slickest lies could shake it. But as I built this new structure, I realized something important. This wasn't just about exposing him. It was about reclaiming myself. For years, I had been silent, letting others define me as the retired builder, the old man in the corner. But the truth on my desk reminded me who I really was. Luis Sanchez, architect, father, the man who built not only walls of stone but a life out of sacrifice. And now I was building again. Not a house this time, but a reckoning. One day soon, Daniel would face the weight of every brick he had tried to throw off his shoulders. And when it collapsed on him, the world would see who had carried it all along. The more I prepared, the more I noticed how reckless Daniel had become. Pride made him careless. He flaunted the mansion as if it were a trophy, hosting parties that spilled across every polished room. Guests wandered through the halls, admiring the details I had designed decades earlier, and Daniel basked in their compliments, never once crediting the man who built it. I began attending these gatherings quietly, blending into the background like a shadow. People hardly noticed me, just the old man with a glass of water, leaning on the edge of the crowd. But I was listening, watching, collecting. Every time Daniel told a lie, every time he claimed ownership, I stored it away. It was evidence, not in paper this time, but in sound and sight. One evening, I watched him boast to a young investor by the grand staircase. "Every curve of this banister, my vision," Daniel said, resting his hand on the railing I had shaped with my own drawings. The investor nodded, impressed, jotting notes as though Daniel's imagination had carved the wood itself. I stood nearby, silent, my jaw tight, my heart steady. I wrote it down later, his words, the date, the witness. Another night, he led a group into the dining room, pointing to the arched ceiling. "Designed it myself," he said with a grin. His in-laws beamed with pride, their eyes daring anyone to challenge him. No one did. No one but me, in silence, recording every detail. The arrogance blinded him. He never imagined that while he performed, I was gathering. He didn't see the small recorder in my pocket, capturing his words. He didn't notice the photographs I discreetly took of him, gesturing toward features of the house, as if they were his creation. Piece by piece, his own lies became my strongest evidence. He thought I was invisible. He thought my silence was surrender. But silence, I had learned, is not the same as absence. It is patience. And patience, when paired with truth, is the sharpest blade. Every boast that left his mouth was another nail in the coffin of his false story, and I was the one holding the hammer. By now, the evidence formed a fortress, but I knew timing was everything. To reveal the truth too soon would be to waste its weight. I needed the perfect moment, an audience that would cut Daniel deeper than any courtroom could, and that moment arrived in the form of an invitation. Clarissa planned a brunch at the mansion. Not just any brunch, but one designed to showcase their wealth to her family's most influential friends. The guest list read like a roster of judges, investors, and politicians, people whose approval Daniel craved, people before whom he performed his grandest lies. As soon as I saw the invitation, I knew this would be the stage. In the days leading up to it, I prepared carefully. I bought a small camera, discreet enough to blend with the decor. I tested its angles in the living room, in the dining hall, by the staircase where Daniel loved to boast. I rehearsed in silence, unfolding the deed, laying it flat, steadying my hand. I pictured the gasps, the shifting glances, the silence that would follow. But I also thought about risk. Daniel's pride was a weapon too, one that could lash out if cornered. So I built layers of protection. I scanned the deed and the receipts, sending copies to trusted friends and storing backups in a locked case. I told myself, even if he tried to destroy me, the truth would outlive the fire. At night, my wife would ask what I was doing, why I spent so many hours in the study. I told her only part of it, that I was organizing old papers, sorting through memories. She looked at me with worry, but also with something else. Trust. She had endured years of silence with me. Now she seemed to sense that silence was coming to an end. I didn't sleep much that week. Instead, I built the moment in my mind like an architect builds a cathedral stone by stone, beam by beam, until the structure stands tall and unshakable. I could almost hear the echo of Daniel's voice breaking under the weight of the truth. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't dreading the next family gathering. I was waiting for it. The night before the brunch, I laid everything out across my desk one final time. The deed rested at the center, its ink bold, unshaken by years. Around it, the receipts, the loan agreements, the letters, the recordings, the photographs, my blueprint of truth. For decades, I had been building structures of stone and steel. Now I had built a structure of evidence, stronger than concrete, sharper than glass. I ran my hand over the deed, remembering the first day I signed it. Back then, I thought of it as security, a safeguard for my family's future. I never imagined it would one day become a weapon against my own blood. But blood, I realized, does not guarantee loyalty. It only guarantees the possibility of betrayal. I packed everything into a leather case, neat, precise, deliberate. Years of sacrifice, compressed into a bundle I could carry in one hand. As I closed the clasp, I felt a stillness settle inside me. This was no longer about rage. Rage burns fast and leaves you empty. This was about justice, about reclaiming the truth Daniel had buried beneath his arrogance. In the quiet of that night, I rehearsed what I would say. Not much. Words were Daniel's arena. He could charm, spin, manipulate. I had no need for speeches. My weapon was silence, followed by the undeniable proof laid flat for all to see. One moment, one gesture. That would be enough. I thought of my wife. She had endured every humiliation beside me, her eyes filled with tears she rarely let fall. She deserved to see the truth rise, to see the chains of silence broken. I promised myself that tomorrow I would not fail her. I thought of Daniel, too. Once, he had run through the mansion's frame with toy hammer in hand, his laughter filling the air like sunlight. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who believed lies were stronger than love. Tomorrow, he would learn otherwise. As dawn crept across the horizon, I closed the leather case and placed it by the door. The decision was made. The foundation was set. Tomorrow, the truth would rise, and when it did, it would crush the lies beneath it. The morning of the brunch arrived, warm sunlight spilling across the mansion's facade. I stood by the window of my study, leather case in hand, watching guests arrive in polished cars. Their laughter drifted across the lawn, bright and brittle, like glass waiting to shatter. I could see Daniel at the entrance, greeting them with a grin as wide as the driveway. He looked like a man certain of his kingdom, but the kingdom was mine. Before I left the study, I opened the case one last time. My fingers rested on the deed, the paper smooth and unyielding. I traced my name, Luis Sanchez, steady and unbroken. All these years, Daniel had mistaken my silence for weakness. Today, he would learn that silence was simply preparation. I slipped the deed into a protective sleeve, slid it back into the case, and locked it shut. Then I tucked a smaller envelope into my jacket, backup copies of the most important documents. Insurance. If Daniel tried to snatch the case, the truth would still survive in my pocket. As I walked down the hallway, I felt the house around me breathe. The beams I had raised, the walls I had plastered, the staircase I had measured to perfection, they all seemed to lean closer, as if listening, as if waiting for justice to be spoken within them. This was not just my home, it was my witness. In the foyer, my wife stood by the mirror, adjusting her scarf with trembling hands. She looked at me, her eyes asking questions her lips didn't dare. I gave her a small nod, a promise carved in silence. Today would be different. She pressed her hand to mine briefly before letting go, her touch warm, steadying. When I stepped outside, Daniel spotted me. His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, just long enough for me to see it, but then returned, polished and bright for his audience. He clapped me on the back, his voice booming. "Glad you could make it, Dad. Come, sit, enjoy what I've built here." I met his gaze, calm and unshaken. For once, I didn't swallow the insult. I carried the truth with me, heavier than stone, stronger than steel, and I was ready to set it down where everyone could see it. I had learned long ago that a structure is only as strong as its supports. So, before stepping into the storm, I made sure mine were secure. In the days before the brunch, I had sent scanned copies of the deed, the receipts, the loan agreements, everything to 3 trusted friends. Old colleagues who had built more than projects with me, they had built trust. Each one promised to hold the documents safe, sealed in envelopes, unopened unless I asked. One even said, "If anything happens, Luis, I'll make sure the world knows the truth." I also placed digital backups in a secure folder, locked with passwords Daniel couldn't guess. Years ago, I might have overlooked technology. Now it was another tool, another wall in my defense. No matter what Daniel tried, the truth would survive me. That morning, as I stood among the clink of glasses and the smell of roasted meats drifting from the kitchen, I reminded myself, I wasn't just a father anymore. I was a builder of justice. My hands had always known how to prepare for collapse, how to anchor a foundation so that it would stand even when everything above it cracked. Today was no different. Daniel strutted through the rooms, shaking hands, laughing too loudly. His in-laws beamed at him as though he were a crown jewel they had polished themselves. He didn't notice me watching from the corner, didn't sense the weight of the case by my chair. To him, I was still the old man, quiet, irrelevant, the perfect illusion. But when I glanced across the table at my wife, her eyes told me she knew. She had seen the copies I sealed, had heard the quiet resolve in my voice. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and I felt strength surge through me. We were not walking into this unprepared. This time, Daniel would not sweep the truth under a rug of laughter and lies. The foundations were set, the walls were braced. All that remained was for the roof to come crashing down on the house of arrogance my son had built, and I was ready to drop the first stone. The brunch unfolded like theater. Silver trays floated through the air, champagne bubbled, and polite laughter echoed off the high ceilings I had once drawn on paper. I moved quietly among the guests, my leather case never leaving my side. No one noticed me slip into the corners, checking angles, setting the small camera I had hidden earlier. Its red light blinked once, then disappeared into silence. Everything was in place. I watched Daniel work the crowd. He was in his element, shaking hands, clapping shoulders, boasting in the way only men drunk on approval can. He guided guests from room to room, his voice rising with pride as he spoke of his mansion, his investment, his empire. Each lie was another thread in the net he wove, a net I knew would collapse as soon as the truth was dropped into it. I lingered near the staircase, pretending to admire the floral arrangements. From here, I could see the dining room where Clarissa's family had arranged their display of wealth, crystal glasses, china plates, polished silver. The table looked like a crown, meant to remind everyone who was king. But I knew who had built the throne. Guests whispered about the mansion's design, pointing at the vaulted ceilings, the intricate woodwork. Daniel basked in their admiration. "Took vision," he said, his hand gliding along the banister I had once sanded smooth. "Hard work pays off." My jaw tightened, but I stayed still. Patience. The time wasn't yet. Then came the toast. Daniel stood at the head of the table, glass raised high, the room hushed in expectation. "To family," he said, pausing to let the word linger. "To legacy, to everything we've built together," the applause thundered, wine splashing over rims, eyes shining with respect that should have been mine. I felt my wife's hand slip into mine under the table. Her grip was steady, firm. It was time. I leaned back, the leather case cool against my leg, and let my breath steady. The stage was set. The audience gathered. The actor basked in applause. Now, the architect would bring down the curtain. Daniel thrived in the spotlight, every word of his toast dripping with false humility. He spoke of hard work, of sacrifice, of perseverance. He painted himself as a man who had risen through grit alone. And the guests believed him. Their nods, their applause, their raised glasses, all of it fed his pride. I stayed seated, watching. My chest burned, but my hands were steady. I had spent too many years building to let anger shake me now. Instead, I studied the faces around the table, the investors, the family friends, the politicians. Each one was a witness waiting to see the truth. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to. When Daniel finished, he placed his glass down and spread his arms wide, basking in the admiration. "And, above all," he said, his voice swelling, I am proud to call this house my own. Every brick, every beam, every stone mine. The words hung in the air like a challenge. A murmur of approval rippled across the room. His in-laws smiled as if they had finally secured proof of their family's superiority. Daniel looked around, his chest rising, his eyes daring anyone to contradict him. I rose slowly. Chairs creaked, heads turned. The air shifted, as if the house itself held its breath. My wife's hand slipped from mine, but not before giving one last squeeze of strength. I reached for the leather case by my chair and set it on the table with a deliberate thud. The sound cut through the chatter, and silence fell. Daniel frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "Dad?" he said, his tone sharp with warning. I didn't answer. Not yet. I unlatched the case, the clasp snapping open in the hush of the room. My hand moved with the precision of a man placing the final stone in an archway. I drew out the deed, its parchment glowing beneath the chandelier light, my name etched clearly across the top. I laid it flat in the center of the table. Gasps rose like a wave. Guests leaned in, whispering. Eyes darted from the document to Daniel, then back to me. Phones slipped discreetly from pockets, cameras ready to capture what was unfolding. Daniel's face drained of color. His lips parted, but no words came. I looked at him, calm, steady, unblinking. And for the first time in years, he was the one who could not speak. The room froze around the deed. Conversations died mid-sentence, glasses hovered halfway to lips, and the only sound was the faint hum of the chandelier above us. I stood tall, my hand resting lightly on the document as though anchoring it to the table. Daniel's eyes darted wildly, searching for a lifeline. This is outdated," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Dad doesn't understand how ownership works. Things have changed." His words tumbled out too fast, too defensive. The guests tilted their heads, doubt stirring in their faces. Some had already lifted their phones, cameras rolling. They wanted proof, and proof was spread before them in ink that would not fade. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. Instead, I pulled out a smaller envelope from my jacket and slid it across the table. Receipts spilled out, tuition bills, loan agreements, transfers, each one marked with my name. They fluttered like leaves in the silence. A man at the far end picked one up, adjusted his glasses, and read aloud, "Paid in full by Luis Sanchez." Murmurs spread like cracks in plaster. Daniel reached across the table, snatching at the papers. "This doesn't matter," he snapped, his smile twisting into desperation. "It's all ancient history. I built myself." His voice rose, but it sounded thin, hollow against the weight of the evidence. I remained still, my silence louder than any rebuttal. I let the room do the work. Eyes turned cold, whispers sharpened, admiration curdled into suspicion. Clarissa's parents stiffened, their carefully groomed smiles fading. One guest set down his phone after recording and leaned back, shaking his head. Daniel's hand trembled as he tried to gather the papers, but there were too many. Each slip of proof scattered like shards of glass, cutting at the story he had spun for years. He couldn't cover them all. He couldn't erase the ink. Finally, he turned to me, anger flashing. "Why now, Dad? Why embarrass me here?" I met his gaze, steady and cold. "Because lies don't belong in the house I built." The words landed heavier than any document, and in that moment, I saw it the empire he had crafted, cracking under the weight of truth. Chaos rippled across the dining room. Guests whispered into one another's ears, their faces turning like weather vanes in a storm. Some pointed at the deed, others at the receipts, scattered like evidence from a crime scene. Phones recorded every detail, lenses catching Daniel's pale face, his trembling hands, the sweat that glistened on his forehead. Clarissa reached for his arm, whispering something sharp, but he yanked away. His pride, once so polished, now cracked in front of everyone. "This is ridiculous," he barked, his voice too loud, too strained. "My father doesn't know what he's talking about. He's old, confused. Don't listen to him." The words stung, but I didn't flinch. I had expected him to lash out. What he didn't expect was how the room would react. Instead of laughter, there was silence. Instead of nods, there were skeptical glances. Years of charm and bravado were unraveling in minutes. A guest near the head of the table leaned forward, frowning. "If this mansion isn't yours, Daniel, then why have you been claiming it as your own?" The question struck like a hammer. Daniel stuttered, no polished answer ready this time. I remained standing, my silence deliberate. I had spent my life building, and builders know the value of letting foundations speak for themselves. The deed, the receipts, the truth, they carried more weight than any argument. Daniel tried to laugh it off, waving his hand as if swatting a fly. "This is just family drama," he said, "nothing serious." But the guests weren't convinced. They shifted in their chairs, uncomfortable, realizing they had been applauding a performance, not reality. Clarissa's father's face tightened, his jaw rigid. For the first time, he looked at Daniel not as an asset, but as a liability. The pride in his eyes turned to calculation, cold and ruthless. He saw what everyone else was beginning to see. Daniel's empire was built on sand. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to prove myself further. The documents, the silence, the witnesses together, they were enough. Daniel was unraveling before his audience, his lies collapsing under the weight of evidence. And I simply stood there, letting the structure fall. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Daniel's face twisted between anger and panic, his usual charm shattered. I knew the moment had come, not for shouting, not for vengeance in words, but for truth spoken plainly, like stone set into mortar. I placed my hand on the deed, steady as bedrock. My voice was calm, low, yet it carried through the hall. This house was built with my hands. Every wall, every beam, every line of the design is mine. The deed is mine. The money that paid for your education, your businesses, even your failures, it came from me. Not from you. Not from them. Me. But gasps rippled. Guests leaned closer, phones angled higher, capturing every syllable. Daniel stood frozen, his mouth open, but no words forming. His arrogance, once so loud, had been stripped bare by the quiet force of truth. I didn't stop there. I pulled another document from the envelope, an old bank transfer receipt, dated and signed. I held it up for the cameras, letting the ink speak louder than I ever could. "This is how you got your start, Daniel. Not through brilliance, through sacrifice. My sacrifice." Clarissa's mother shifted uncomfortably, her jeweled fingers tightening around her glass. Her father's eyes narrowed, calculating the damage. Around the table, admiration for Daniel curdled into pity, then into contempt. He wasn't the self-made man he claimed to be. He was a fraud propped up by a father he tried to erase. Daniel finally found his voice, but it cracked like broken glass. "Why are you doing this to me?" he demanded, desperation leaking through the bravado. I met his eyes, unblinking. "I'm not doing anything to you. I'm showing them what you did to me." The words landed like a final nail driven into wood. The room shifted again, not toward him, but away. His in-laws avoided his gaze. Guests murmured about betrayal, and cameras captured his downfall in real time. For years, Daniel had tried to build himself taller by making me smaller, but in that moment, the truth stood taller than both of us, and there was nothing he could do to tear it down. The collapse was swift. One moment Daniel was glowing beneath chandeliers, and the next he was drowning in whispers and flashing cameras. Guests no longer applauded, they documented. Phones captured his paling face, his frantic gestures, his futile attempts to sweep the papers back into order. But order was gone. Truth had taken the room, and there was no reclaiming it. Clarissa tried to salvage dignity, urging the guests to focus on the food, the wine, anything but the scene unraveling before them. Yet no one looked at the platters or the champagne. Their eyes were fixed on Daniel, the man who claimed to be an owner, now exposed as nothing more than a tenant of lies. I sat back down, calm as stone, letting the weight of silence crush him. My work was done. I had placed the final beam. The structure of truth stood on its own now. Every word he spoke only weakened him further. "It's just paperwork," he insisted, his laugh high-pitched and brittle. "A misunderstanding." But the more he spoke, the deeper he sank. Clarissa's father rose slowly, his expression carved from granite. "You told us this house was yours," he said, his voice cutting. "You let us believe your fortune was your own. Was it all built on your father's back?" His words were not just accusation, they were verdict. Around him, heads nodded, the jury unanimous. Daniel's shoulders slumped. He had no answer. For years he had worn arrogance like armor. Now, stripped of it, he looked small, just a boy caught in a lie too big to survive. My wife reached for my hand under the table, her touch trembling but proud. I gave it a gentle squeeze. We had been humiliated together for too long. Tonight, justice belonged to us. As the guests began to file out, some avoided Daniel's eyes, others shook their heads in disgust. A few paused by me, offering quiet nods of respect. Not words, just acknowledgement, and that was enough. Within hours, The videos spread online. Clips of Daniel's downfall went viral, his stammering, the deed, the documents fluttering across the table. By nightfall, his empire of lies was trending for the wrong reasons. Allies withdrew. Investors vanished. His name, once polished, now dragged through the mud. I didn't celebrate. I didn't smile. I simply sat in the home I had built, watching justice echo through its walls. Daniel had tried to erase me with words, but I had answered with truth, and truth had gone farther than any lie could ever reach. The morning after the brunch, the mansion was quiet in a way I hadn't heard in years. No laughter, no clinking glasses, no hollow toasts, just silence, thick and honest. Sunlight crept across the dining room table, glinting off the abandoned crystal, illuminating the deed that still lay there, untouched. Proof, waiting. Like a crown no one dared claim but me. I walked through the house slowly, each step echoing against the floors I had once sanded with my own hands. The air felt lighter, as if the walls themselves had been freed from the lies Daniel draped over them. For so long, this place had been a stage for his arrogance. Now, it was mine again, not because of a battle won, but because the truth had been spoken aloud, undeniable. Daniel didn't come home that night. I heard later he had gone to Clarissa's parents' estate, begging for their support. But the video had spread too far, too fast. By dawn, millions had seen him unravel. His allies had begun to distance themselves, issuing quiet statements, retracting deals. The same voices that once praised him now whispered his name with contempt. I sat in my study, leather case open, documents neatly stacked again. For years, I had looked at those papers as reminders of my sacrifices. Now they felt like armor I had finally put to use. They were no longer symbols of what I had lost, but of what I had preserved, the truth. My wife entered quietly, her footsteps soft. She placed a cup of coffee beside me, then rested her hand on my shoulder. For a moment, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. Her eyes said everything: relief, pride, and something I hadn't seen in years: peace. I closed the case and leaned back, exhaling slowly. Daniel had begged for forgiveness before, in smaller ways. This time, I knew it was coming too. He would try to twist this collapse into another story, another plea. But the difference now was that the world had seen. There was no covering this up. For the first time in decades, I felt unchained. My silence had ended, my dignity restored. I wasn't waiting for Daniel's recognition anymore. I had my own. The mansion stood around me, steady as ever, its beams strong, its foundation unshaken. And for the first time in a long time, so was I. The days after the brunch passed like a quiet storm. The world outside was roaring. Videos of Daniel's humiliation played on every screen. Articles dissected his lies. Commentators mocked his fall. But inside the mansion, there was calm. For the first time in years, I could breathe without the weight of pretense pressing on my chest. My wife sat with me on the porch in the evenings, her hand wrapped around mine, her gaze soft and unburdened. She didn't speak much about what had happened, but I could see the change in her. The worry lines that had etched themselves deep into her face seemed to soften. The tears she once shed in silence were gone, replaced with a quiet pride. She had stood beside me through humiliation, through betrayal, through nights when I doubted myself. Now, she was standing beside me in truth. And that, more than anything, felt like justice. One evening, she said softly, "You did what needed to be done." Just 7 words, but they carried the weight of decades. I turned to her and saw the relief in her eyes. And for the first time in years, I felt like the man she had married again. The builder, the protector, the one who carried her dreams as carefully as my own. I realized then that the revenge had never been only about Daniel. It had been about restoring what he tried to steal from both of us: dignity. For years, she had endured the disrespect, the cold dinners, the laughter at our expense. She had watched me sacrifice until I was hollow, and she had borne the burden too. Now, she finally saw the scales balance. We sat in the fading light, watching the oaks sway gently in the wind. The mansion glowed in the dusk, no longer a monument to Daniel's arrogance, but a sanctuary again. Our sanctuary. I knew the world was still tearing Daniel apart, that his empire of lies was collapsing faster than he could rebuild it. But I didn't care to follow every headline. The real victory was here, in the quiet peace of home, in the steady warmth of my wife's hand. For the first time in decades, we weren't carrying him anymore. We were simply living. Word travels fast when scandal wears your family name. Within days, Calls began to arrive, not for Daniel, but for me. Old colleagues reached out, voices thick with sympathy and admiration. "We saw the video, Luis. You carried yourself with dignity," one said. Another wrote, "You taught him better. The shame is his, not yours." Family friends, too, came back into the fold. People who had once distanced themselves when Daniel married into wealth now returned, their tone different, apologetic, respectful. They remembered the man who had helped them build their homes, who had offered advice freely, who had stood quietly at the edges of gatherings while being mocked. They remembered me, not the version Daniel tried to erase. Even the neighbors, who had once looked at the mansion as a symbol of Daniel's success, now looked at me differently. They waved. They stopped to talk. They called me Mr. Sanchez again, not Daniel's father. It was as if the fog had lifted and people could finally see clearly who had laid the foundation of everything. I didn't bask in it. Admiration wasn't what I wanted. What mattered was recognition, the restoration of truth. For years, I had been a ghost in my own life, erased by the son I had raised. Now, when people spoke my name, they spoke it with respect, not because of vengeance, but because the truth had surfaced. My wife noticed it too. She smiled more often, her shoulders less heavy. When friends visited, they no longer looked at her with pity, but with warmth. She told me one evening, "It feels like we finally came home." And I understood. The house had always been ours, but now it felt alive again, no longer a stage for Daniel's lies. I walked through its halls with my head higher, each room echoing with memories that were once painful but now vindicated. The mansion stood taller in my eyes, not because of its grandeur, but because it once again reflected the truth of the man who built it. I hadn't just reclaimed my dignity, I had reclaimed my place in the story. And this time, no one could take it away. News spread faster than fire, but what burned brightest was not Daniel's shame, it was the reaction of his in-laws. The family that once paraded him as their golden son-in-law suddenly turned cold. Their smiles vanished, their doors closed. I heard from a neighbor that Clarissa's father, furious about the scandal, had cut Daniel off from every business connection he once flaunted. The empire Daniel thought he had inherited through marriage crumbled in a matter of days. I wasn't surprised. Those people were loyal only to power and appearances. As long as Daniel looked like a success, they embraced him. But when the truth showed him as a fraud, they abandoned him just as quickly. That was the world he chose over me, the world of hollow pride and shallow loyalty. And now he was tasting it for what it was. I saw Clarissa once in town, stepping out of her car with sunglasses hiding her face. She didn't greet me. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than any insult she had ever thrown my way. It was the silence of someone who regretted ever tying her name to Daniel's. She was retreating, protecting her image, leaving him to drown alone. My wife asked me if I felt sorry for him. I thought about it. I thought about the boy who once ran through scaffolding with a toy hammer, his laughter echoing in the half-built mansion. But then I remembered every humiliation, every denial, every time he used my silence as his stage. Pity had no place left in me. He had chosen this path, step by arrogant step. What struck me most was how quickly the allies he relied on abandoned him. Investors pulled funding, partners canceled deals, friends stopped answering his calls. The same voices that once cheered his name now whispered it like a warning. He was radioactive, untouchable. And through it all, I didn't have to lift another finger. The truth was doing all the work. The mansion stood unshaken, the deed still mine, my name steady on its walls. Meanwhile, Daniel's name crumbled outside these doors. He had tried to erase me to rise higher. Instead, he erased himself, and I had only needed to wait. Some nights, after the storm settled, I walked the halls of the mansion alone. The oak floors creaked beneath my steps, a familiar sound that once felt heavy with humiliation but now rang steady, proud. I stopped often, my hand tracing the staircase banister, the stone fireplace, the archways of the dining room. Each detail was mine, conceived in my mind, drawn by my hands, built with my labor. They had once been twisted into props for Daniel's arrogance. Now, they were restored to what they had always been, proof of my devotion. In the quiet, I remembered the nights I had built this place. How I stayed up late, poring over blueprints, erasing and redrawing until the lines felt right. How I stood outside in the cold with a thermos of coffee, watching crews pour concrete, making sure every corner held. I remembered carrying Daniel on my shoulders through these empty rooms, promising him it would all be his, one day not as a prize, but as a legacy. That legacy had been tarnished, yes, but not destroyed, because in the end, the house had never betrayed me. The walls had absorbed every insult. The beams had held firm under the weight of lies, and when the truth finally came, the house stood taller than ever. My son had tried to erase me with words, but the very structure he claimed was his revealed the truth. It was mine. One evening, as I sat in the living room with the fire crackling, my wife joined me. She looked around the room, her eyes soft. "It feels like home again," she whispered. I nodded, understanding. For years, this place had felt like a theater where we were forced to play roles written by Daniel's arrogance. Now it was ours once more, filled not with shame, but with peace. I leaned back in my chair, the flames warming my face, and I felt something I hadn't in a long time, freedom. Not from debt, not from struggle, but from the weight of silence. I had spoken, I had revealed, I had reclaimed, and in that freedom, the mansion no longer felt like a burden. It felt like victory, carved into stone and wood. It wasn't long before Daniel came back, not with the arrogance he once wore, but with desperation clinging to him like a second skin. He showed up unannounced, his suit wrinkled, his tie askew, his eyes hollow from sleepless nights. He stood in the doorway of the mansion, my mansion, and for the first time in years, he looked small. "Dad," he started, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I need to talk." I let him in, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but because I wanted him to see the house as it truly was. Steady, unshaken, mine. He walked through the halls slowly, his hands brushing the walls, as though touching them could make them his again. But the house did not answer him. It belonged to the man who built it, not the one who claimed it. We sat across from each other in the living room, the fire crackling between us. He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I lost everything," he said. "Investors, friends, Clarissa, even her family won't speak to me. I don't know what to do." His words might once have pierced me, but now they barely stirred the surface. I had carried his burdens for too long to feel their weight again. "You built a life on lies, Daniel," I said quietly, "and lies don't hold." He flinched, as though the truth itself had struck him. "I know," he muttered. Then, after a long silence, he looked up. I just want you to forgive me." Forgiveness. The word hung in the air like smoke, thick and choking. For years, I had waited for recognition, for acknowledgement, for any sign that he saw what I had given. And now, when the world had already stripped him bare, he came asking for what he never gave me: absolution. I studied him, his face worn, his pride broken. And I felt nothing, not anger, not triumph. Just clarity. Forgiveness was not mine to give, because forgiveness meant looking back, and I had no reason to look behind me anymore. "I can't give you that," I said finally, my voice calm, final. "Not because I hate you, but because I'm done carrying you." His eyes filled, but I didn't move. The fire cracked louder, filling the silence between us. For the first time, Daniel understood, and for the first time, I was free. The last time I saw Daniel, he stood in the doorway of the mansion, shadows stretching across his face. He lingered there, as if waiting for something, maybe for me to call him back, maybe for a sliver of forgiveness I had already told him would never come. But I said nothing. I simply watched as he turned and walked away, his shoulders bent, his steps unsteady. The boy with the toy hammer was gone. The man who tried to erase me was all that remained. I closed the door softly, not with anger, but with finality. The echo rang through the halls, not like an ending, but like a release. My wife came to my side, her hand slipping into mine, and together we stood in the silence of the home I had built. A silence that no longer felt like chains, it felt like freedom. The next morning, I sat at the dining room table, the deed resting in front of me. Sunlight poured through the windows, spilling across my name written in ink that had outlasted decades of sacrifice and betrayal. Luis Sanchez. That was all it said, and that was all it needed to say. I thought about the journey, the years of sacrifice, the nights of humiliation, the weight of silence. I thought about the laughter at the country club, the smirks of in-laws who had treated me like a burden, the cruel words of a son who believed lies were stronger than love. All of it had led to this: the truth standing firm, the lies shattered. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't need it. What I felt was lighter than pride, stronger than revenge. I felt free. Free from carrying Daniel's failures, free from waiting for his acknowledgement, free from the silence that had once suffocated me. I walked through the mansion one last time, not as a man haunted, but as its rightful architect. The oak beams, the carved railings, The stone fireplace they no longer whispered of betrayal. They stood as they always had, steady, enduring, mine. At the door I paused, looking back only once. The house glowed in the morning light, solid and unshaken, and I whispered, not to Daniel, not to anyone else, but to myself. Son, I built this place. You just tried to steal it with your mouth. Any ride. Then I stepped outside, the sun warm on my face, and walked forward without regret, without forgiveness, without looking back.